Gensis. Sorry, I'm starting the video a little bit late. We just got into it. But anyway, oh, and there's Arlene. Hello, Arlene. Good to see you. All right. You're down in Florida still?
Yes, I am.
Okay, well, hello from Florida. So be prepared. It's snowing up here.
That's what I hear. Shelley just arrived today.
Oh, okay. Well, very good. Well, I'm glad she got down there safely. So, Shelley with you?
Yes, she is.
Okay. Well, hello, Shelley, too. All right. So, we're doing Numbers and Psalm 90.
Okay.
And just got done talking about the title, so we're going now. So there's two main theological themes that we're looking at in the book of Numbers. One is on God's promises that will be fulfilled, and also the idea that God is a just God and that God treats everyone equally. So it's in those two themes that you'll see this repeated over and over and over again when you look at Numbers. Now, if I remember the last time we met, which was 2 weeks ago because of Ash Wednesday, there was someone in the conference room, and I forget exactly who it was, but one of you in the conference room there, when I said we were doing Numbers next, said, "Yuck, Numbers." That they really disliked the book because of just lists and names. But there's a lot of really good stories in it. And in actuality, it has, of the first 5 books in the Bible, it has the most complex literary structure of any of the 5. So what you have is, overall, you have a parallelism that's occurring. So there's a census in the beginning and there's a census near the end. Then along with the two census, the first census of the old generation, so to speak, and the second census of the new generation after the 40 years of wandering. Then you also have 2 rebellions. In chapter 13, you got the old generation rebellion, but then in chapter 25, you got the new generation with its rebellion. And then you got these provisions for cleansing and atonement. And one occurs in chapter 15, and that's for the old generation. And then in chapter 19, it's talking about the new generation. And so you have this parallelism that's occurring throughout the book that's linking the different parts of the book to each other. Then you have a lot of different lists, and this is the part that I believe whoever that was 2 weeks ago was saying yuck to. Where you have all the unpronounceable names and son of this and son of that, and it seemingly goes on forever. And some of them are quite repetitious in the way they go about things. So you have the censuses that I just talked about. You have the listing of the offerings to the Lord. In chapter 21, you got a little travel log itinerary that occurs. And then there's another itinerary traveling itinerary that occurs in chapter 33. You got all the offerings of the daily offerings and then the festival offerings listed. You have the boundaries laid out, and you have the towns of the Levites. So all that's included within this parallelism that's going on. And then intermixed in that, you have all these pieces of poetry. And some of them are quite famous, like the priest's blessing of the people in chapter 6, 24 through 26. I'll just turn to it right now. If any of you have your Bibles with you there, if you could just turn to Numbers chapter 6, 24 through 26. Would someone want to read that? You
What
got it,
chapter are you
Arlene?
in?
Yeah, go ahead. Read it, Arlene.
What chapter?
Chapter 6,
6.
verses 24 to 26. I thought you were raising your hand when you're putting it up to the camera there, Arlene.
No, I was trying to find out what chapter you were in.
Oh, okay.
I missed the chapter.
Oh, I'm
And then
sorry.
the verses was what?
24 to 26.
Oh, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So they shall put my name on the children of Israel, and I will bless them.
So isn't that amazing? You hear that a lot of times as a benediction that a minister will use. And it's even in our book of worship, the Methodist book of worship also as a benediction to be given. So right there's a piece of famous poetry that we get from Numbers. Then you have what's called the Song of the Ark. And these were the words that Moses would speak when they were about to move out as a camp and go out on the march as a group. And that's found in chapter 10, verses 35 through 36. Someone want to go to that, chapter 10, 35 through 36?
So it was whenever the ark set out that Moses said, Rise up, O Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. And when it rested, he said, Return, O Lord, to the many thousands of Israel.
All right. Kind of motivating words, huh? Let your enemies be scattered. Go on out there, let's get them, type of thing. But so that's another piece of poetry in there. And then the Song of the Well and the Ballad over at Hesbon, they're a little bit longer. Those are actually what in Hebrew they would call military ballads. And they're actually songs for military. And then we have the very lengthy prophetic oracles of Balaam, the prophet, or as some call him, the false prophet, because he, as we'll see later, he doesn't do too well. So you have these nice pieces of poetry in there, some of them significant and still with us today. And then you have listings of law put in there. And this law actually adds to the laws that were already given that we went over 2 weeks ago in Leviticus, but we deal with restitution, we deal with a wife suspected of adultery, a Nazirite vow, law of sacrifice, a red heifer, and laws of vows, and the law of the refuge cities. And these laws, each of these topics were talked about in Leviticus, but what these laws do is basically clarify those laws that we previously went over. And so what's amazing is all of this, all these different literary styles are all nicely assembled together, and at the same time in this nice parallelism where you have the bookends occurring. And it occurs in two major divisions. The The first division all deals with the old generation. And then beginning in chapter 26, we're talking about the new generation. So it's really a complex structure that Numbers is put in. It's really, in a lot of ways, it's a literary masterpiece in that regard of how it was organized, despite all the boring names and unpronounceable things that you come across. So, any questions or comments before we go on? One of the things I dislike about teaching 100% online, I'm used to seeing people's interactions and everything, and I can't always get the sense. But okay, well, very good then. So the first part we get laid out, and I talked about the two census that are given, and so we start off first in Numbers, and they're laying out the leaders of each of the tribes. And then they do a census. And the census is of everyone that's 20 years old or more, because they're looking at it in terms of military strength. So when you look at the numbers, you got to think of that this isn't their entire population, that this is only the men, and it's those that are able to fight in the military. So the women aren't counted and children aren't counted in this. So always keep that in mind when you're looking at the numbers. And so then they give a listing of the numbers, and I have it there on your sheet on the second page. I have a little table laid out, and it gives you all the different numbers of all the different tribes. In this order that they do the tribes in, you'll see that order repeated throughout Numbers. This is the same order then that the offerings to the tabernacle are presented. This is the same order that they will do it later on when they do a census again. And so I also then include the count from the second census in Numbers 26, which is the new generation after the old had passed away. And you see, by the end, it's fairly close overall. We're talking only a difference of about 1,750 people of 20-year-old or older men. And you can see the differences in some of the tribes, too, how they varied in terms of their fighting strength as we go in. Some grew, but lots of them decreased in size. Okay, now the arrangement of tribes is discussed then in the second chapter through the third chapter of Numbers, and you can see a picture of the arrangement there, the way the tribes are arranged, with then the different clans of the Levites in the center surrounding the tabernacle. And that's the way they would be laid out when they were in camp. And he did them in groups of 4, both in camp and in marching. They're in these groups of 4. And the groups of 4 are around the tribe of Judah, Dan, Ephraim, and Reuben. And then the other tribes fall into those. And if you look at the numbers and you add them up, basically the tribe of Judah is the largest of this group. And then the other ones are fairly balanced, with the west end being kind of the smallest. And if you go to the next page, you see them in marching order and how they marched out and traveled. And the significance of this is kind of an interesting note that some scholars have noted is this bears a striking resemblance to Ramses II, who was an Egyptian pharaoh, and we have detailed accounts of his military actions, of how his army would march and where he would place his religious elements for his unit as they were marching out. And so some, specifically this gentleman, Herbert Wolf, that I cite here, kind of wonder, how that similarity came about. It makes for a very viable fighting force, one that can reinforce itself from all angles. No matter what angle it's attacked from, it has strength, and it protects then what it considers the most valuable items. So militarily, it makes for a smart way of doing it, of doing business. So that's, brings us through those first set of chapters. We lay all this stuff out of where the tribes are and how they're arranged and how they're going to be marching out and going forward. Are there any questions about that or comments? Oh boy, everyone's just riveted. Okay. Well, then we go into the rebellion, the first big rebellion. This is the old generation. So they go up to a place called Kadesh. And Kadesh is just, it's southwest of Bethlehem. And it's about a 2-week journey on foot from Mount Sinai. Where Mount Sinai is going up, it's about a 2-week journey. Instead of being on the one side of the Jordan, this places them on the underbelly of the Promised Land. And what we should take note of is in this part, what happens are the people convince Moses to send 12 spies up. God didn't command Moses to send the 12 up. The people get him to do it. So he chooses one from each tribe, and he puts his aide, Joshua, in that mix, along with Caleb, and then 10 others. And altogether, on this 40-day journey that they do, this big reconnaissance of the Promised Land, they go to the very, very tippy-top north of what will be the land that God is promising to them, all the way through to the bottom. Altogether, it's about a 500-mile journey that they're taking. And they're doing this all on foot. And then they come back. And when they come back, they give a report about all the great fruit of the land and how abundant it is. It's pretty much everything that God promised them. But, and then there comes the big but. And Linda, you want to say what the big but is? No?
Well, they report, we can't do this. We can't take the land.
Yeah, why do they think they can't take the land?
Well, there are giants in the land.
Yeah, they talk about giants in the land, that they look like grasshoppers, big fortified cities, extremely strong military. There ain't no way we can take it. Now, Joshua and Caleb, though, disagree. And they remind them about the promises of God and that God will be going before them and that they can conquer the land because of God. Well, the people are swayed by the negative and not the positive report, which is not unusual if you think about crowd psychology. The negative always seems to carry a stronger weight regardless of experience. And if you think about the experience these people have had, I mean, they have actually heard the booming voice of God. They've seen the cloud of God descend upon them. They've had the cloud going in front of them while they traveled during the day, and fire if they had to travel at night. God was always with them. I mean, they've seen all these things already. They've experienced it. And yet, despite all that, they embrace this negative report, and they kind of like, oh, woe is us. Why are we going up there? Oh, you brought us out here just to die. And they go through that whole litany all over again. And God tells Moses that he's going to wipe them all out. Now, this is the second time God has said that. We saw God said that in Exodus. And here God, when the people made the golden calf and they were worshiping the golden calf instead of God. God wanted to wipe them out then. Well, here we are again. God wants to wipe them out again, except for Joshua and Caleb. And of course, Moses. And he says, okay, let me wipe them all out and I'll start again with you, Moses. And lo and behold, Moses does exactly what he did before, and he intervenes for the people. And he asks God not to do it. He puts up the interesting argument that, well, God, if you wipe them all out, you're going to look real bad to those Egyptians. What will those Egyptians think? You brought them all the way up here and just to destroy them? So you won't look very good. Kind of an argument saying that it wouldn't be really for your glory, for God's glory. And so God decides, notice on this case, God decides he's still going to wipe them out, except not all of them. He's going to wipe out the adults, 20 years and older. But he's going to do it a little slower over a 40-year period of time. They're still being punished. They're still going to get wiped out, but it's going to be done over a period of time. And that's what God decides going to do. He gives that judgment out. And the people know about that judgment. And interestingly, they're humiliated, they're shamed by it. But then a group of them say, oh, well, we're sorry we rebelled against God, so let's rebel against God again. And they decide they're going to go up and attack the land, which is again rebelling against God. Because God already said, you're not going up there, forget it. They say, oh, we're going to go do it this time. And they go up there and it's just a massacre. The group that goes up to attack are just wiped out. And it's a massacre. And so at that now, we begin what people talk about as the 40 years in the wilderness. 40 years of wandering. It's important to note that these 40 years, it is a thing of punishment for their sin. And it's being borne by the whole nation. In some ways, you can think of it almost like the 70 years in exile. And so this is a period of punishment. The term wilderness and being in the wilderness is an important term biblically, not just in the sense of it's a wild area apart from civilization, which is how some people interpret it, but theologically it's important in the sense of a time of separation from God. God's there, but you're kind of on the outs. We know God's always present regardless, but all of us, I'm sure, can think of a time when we felt apart from God, or God wasn't, we just didn't feel God real close. And in this is 40 years in the wilderness, in the sense of wilderness of being separated from God, apart from God, not feeling close to God. And time again, during this period, which is summed up so quickly in just a few chapters in Numbers, we see that the interaction with God is pretty much always on the negative. And even for poor Moses at one point, who, remember about this time now, Moses, during this part of the journey, and when he happens to goof and sin, he has to be pushing about 110, getting to 120. So the poor guy's pretty old. But it's always on the negative, and so that's where sometimes some people looking at the wilderness, too, being in that sense, apart and separated from God. Does anyone have any comments or questions or thoughts they'd like to share?
Is there any significance in the number 40? Like Jesus said, the walk was 40 days. This is 40 years.
You got, yeah, and you had Noah in the ark.
Noah in the ark, yep.
Yep. 40 is a number that comes into play quite often in the Bible, and it is in terms of time alone with God, period of contemplation, repentance. That's one of the things that led the Nicene Council in 315 to come up with the idea of 40 days for Lent, which we're doing right now, not counting Sundays. So it is never explicitly explained in the Bible. So scriptures, at no point does it say 40 days mean X. But it always seems to be a period of time, used as a period of time, like 40 days of the flood, God's punishment on the world, boom. 40 days fasting in the wilderness, that's his time to deprive of himself in order to, dwell on God and focus on God. Self-denial type thing. But then notice the exile for Israel later is 70 years. So that's, there's a lot of different speculation, but there's nothing explicitly stated in Scripture as to why 40. Yeah, did someone have, Arlene?
Yeah, why don't they include Sundays?
Oh, in Lent? Because each Sunday is a mini Easter. Each Sunday is a mini Easter where we're celebrating the resurrection of Christ. That's why they don't include each of the Sundays in Lent. Okay?
Okay.
All right. Anyway, any other thoughts, comments? Okay. All right. So then notice once they get going into the wilderness, and basically they go back down due south, and then they're going to come up back around to be on the other side of the Jordan once they eventually come back up. So they're just really kind of going down and around and then coming up this way. The first thing that happens is you get about 250 individuals men who are in leadership positions of some sort, and their three big leaders there are Korah and Dathan and Abiram, and they are both from the tribes of Levi and Reuben. Two of them from Reuben, Korah's from Levi, and they say, hey, we think God is with us, not you guys. And who put you in charge, so to speak? And so they try to basically overthrow Moses and Aaron. And what they're doing is something, if you think about it, it's something that happens often. I shouldn't say often, maybe it's often, I don't know. I've never done a frequency count, but it's something that happens sometimes in churches or or in different organizations that are religious, where individuals will arise using God to try to claim power. And really what they're doing is they're all doing it for themselves and their own selfish purposes, but they use God as the basis for doing that. And Korah, if you remember, his clan within the Levites responsible for the tabernacle, and so he's the leader of this group responsible for the tabernacle. So he's saying, well, I must be important, or else God wouldn't have put me in charge of all this and handling it. So why, Moses, that old guy, why would he be the leader? And Moses goes to God, and God tells him to get fire and incense and to bring those lanterns with fire and incense together and then see which one God accepts. And what happens is that when he does that, they go off to do it, but they're still complaining, and God just says, I'm going to wipe out everyone again. And now for a third time, Moses intervenes. And so it's the thing of separate yourself from those rebelling. And if you do, you won't be killed within this group. And so they are standing in their tents. You got to imagine the others get away. The earth opens up and consumes them. And takes them all out. Kills them all their possessions, all their family. If they had cats, the cats went too. If they were Mark Gerger, his big stuffed yellow ducky behind him would go down. Everything would disappear. And so the rest of the people end up getting a little upset by that. Seeing these 250 men and their families and everything go down. And they grumble and argue about Moses and Aaron also. And then a plague starts going through the camp to wipe them out. And eventually what happens is Moses says, well, tell you what, let's take these staffs, and each leader of the tribe will have a staff made with the tribe's name on it, and we're going to take them and see which one flowers and blooms, and that'll be who God is putting as leadership. And Aaron's blooms. Aaron's blossoms and blooms, thus confirming the leadership. We go a little bit later there, and we get the people grumbling again. And this time, it's after Miriam has died, and they're grumbling about water. And God tells Moses, speak to the rock. And if you speak to the rock, water will come out. And Moses, for some reason, whether he's just so upset with the people by this point, we're not told exactly the reason for it, but Moses strikes the rock angrily. And water comes out for the people, and it's there. But God says to Moses, since he lacked faith and had struck the rock with his staff, that he wouldn't go into the promised land. And then from there, Aaron ends up dying and is taken up to Mount Hor. And he gives his garments to Eleazar, and Eleazar is robed as the high priest, his son Eleazar, and then Aaron dies on Mount Hor. We then go from there to some military victories, and what you got to imagine now is now they're beginning to work their way up to the eastern side, on the other side of the Jordan there, in what today would be called Jordan, the country of Jordan, and we also have the West Bank area in that area. But anyway, they move up and they encounter different battles, and they have different military victories as they're going up. First, you have King Arad, and he's in the southern part of Canaan. And he goes out to beat him up, and he loses and is defeated. Then you got King Shinan of the Amorites, and he goes out to attack him and is defeated. And that leads them to capture what's called the Transjordan region. And then from there, you got King Og, and he ends up being defeated. And so by that time, they're settling, this big mob of people, all organized mob now in camps. They're settling in this area around Moab. And that's where they're encamped at this time, where then we pick up the story of Balak and Balaam. So before we go into that, I'm going to pause again and ask, are there any questions or thoughts or comments? Okay, I take the silence. I'm not seeing anybody here waving frantically or anything. Is that a Slurpee you got there, Arlene?
No, but it's pretty good.
Okay. All right. Well, okay, then we got Balak and Balaam. And Balaam is what some call as the false prophet, and he is one that's kind of hard to understand, but one that has a legacy that goes before him, that he leaves with. And it's not a good legacy. So first off, most likely Balaam is an Edomite. We get that from his name and how his name is in the Hebrew. It indicates that he is of an Edomite line. And so that's what we believe he might be, is an Edomite. He is a pagan diviner that's used by God for this specific purpose. But we got to keep in mind that he is a pagan diviner. In Numbers chapter 24, verse 1, it states that he did not resort to sorcery, the implied being that he did use sorcery at other times. And it's just that this time he didn't bother using sorcery. The sacrifices that he ends up asking King Balak to do 4 different times, they are not the sacrifices that we saw in Leviticus or laid out in Leviticus. These are typical sacrifices of pagan diviners of the time, where what they would do is they would take the innards of the critters that they sacrificed, and they'd swish them around in a big bowl, and then how they splashed about and ended up would supposedly give them divine revelation. And so what he is doing, we know from other archaeological evidence, is the same type of sacrifices that pagan diviners did in other areas around Canaan and that area. It's the exact same kind of sacrifices, the exact same number of animals, everything like that. So we have pretty sure knowledge that he was a pagan diviner, and those sacrifices are primarily to read the entrails of the animal, but God gives him a revelation each time to read, and gives him the knowledge that he cannot say anything except what God tells him to say. And so he goes forward, he finally is convinced to go there. We have the, Mr. Ed story there. If you remember Mr. Ed, the talking horse, you got Mr. Ed. Oh, and Mr. Ed just popped up there on Susan's picture there. Susan, that's your dog.
Yes, he wants to see what's happening.
Yeah.
For too long.
Hey,
So
perfect timing for him. Yeah,
There
so there we go. Perfect timing. Yeah, we end up having this talking donkey. Balaam's riding along, following with them, and the God's mad at Balaam, and there's an angel trying to block him, and the donkey sees the angel. Of course, Balaam doesn't, and every time the donkey starts, Balaam gets more and more mad, and he starts beating the donkey, and then the donkey starts talking to him. And I don't know about you, but every time I read that, I know Audrey and I, every time we read it, we're surprised that he's not surprised about the donkey talking to him. Just acts like it's a normal, everyday occurrence. But when he sees the angel, he sees it as it is, an angel, and he has respect for it, and is told, okay, remember, you can't say anything except exactly what God tells you to say. And so that's really beaten into him pretty good. And Balaam then 4 times is taken to places that overview and sees the camp of Israel. And hopefully that gives you the idea of the scope of the camp of Israel, of how large this is. That, you take, this has to be over 1 million individuals when you count the women and children. So 601,000 people, men of fighting age, and then if you throw in the women and children, you gotta be somewhere over the 1 million mark. Some, I've seen estimates of 1.5 million, seen them up to 2 million. We don't know the exact number, but you can assume it's over 1 million somewhere, easy enough. That's a lot of people to be spread out in the camp and camped in a different area. And it's not like they're just all going to be sitting in a football field, or in Reader's Social Hall or something like that. So he goes to 4 different sites, and the king keeps on thinking somehow he's going to get him to curse the Israelites. And because he always have to say what God tells him to say, he can't. And in the 4th and final blessing of Israel, that 4th oracle, which are these nice works of poetry, we have this messianic prophecy that's put in there on chapter 24, verse 7. A star will come out of Jacob, a scepter will rise out of Israel. And that's one of a famous messianic prophecy. It was a messianic prophecy that was viewed by the Jews as referring to a prophecy of the Messiah. So that's a very famous line out of that 4th blessing. Now, we often wonder later, Balaam ends up dying, and he's not referred to very nicely. And even more later in the New Testament, he's spoke of really, really bad as a false prophet. And we often wonder why, because it seemed like he was always doing what God said. Well, one of the things occurs next is, so he doesn't beat them or defeat them with a curse. Balaam obviously somewhere came up with this nice ingenious plan. Let's send these Moabite women in there to kind of intermingle with everyone and to start enticing them to fall away from God. And basically the ingenious plan is you get enough of these men worshiping pagan gods and doing that, God will be upset with them, and then voila, that will be good enough. And then the Midianite king won't have to worry about things. And so that's done. And it comes in there, and they do intermingle. We're told they even go to worshiping Baal, a pagan god. And this is the new generation now. This is their rebelling. And what happens is God again sends a plague through the camp. And the plague is finally stopped by Phinehas, who happens to be the grandson of Aaron. Aaron's grandson kind of comes in and saves the day. And he sees this one woman coming in, the guy bringing the woman in, just not even trying to hide her or anything. And he goes into his tent with her, starts having sex with her, and Phinehas comes in and he drives a spear through both of them as they are together. And that stops the plague. Because God sees someone that is righteous for him and has the righteous anger for God. And there's a difference between a person just being angry and upset and one having righteous anger. Because what Phoene's anger is to do is to uphold God. And he sees what they are doing as an affront to God. If that makes any sense. Versus being angry because you feel like you personally have been offended. And your anger is for a selfish reason. So in that, God, sees it, blesses it, and the plague stops. And then you have the attack on the Midianites. And in attacking the Midianites, that's when Balaam dies. And we learned of Balaam's death. And he's a false prophet who kind of gets cursed as well. From there, we go on and we talk about the inheritance rights of women. And this is significant. It's significant because it shows how liberal, now get my words here, how liberal the Israelites are. Often we look at the laws and the things we talked about 2 weeks ago, and we look at all these things and we say, gee golly whiz, how harsh and cruel they are. And when you look at these things, and if you don't put them in the context of the time, and you try to look at them in the context of our time and period, they seem harsh and cruel. But if you look at them in the context of the time right then and there, and the other nations around historically, it's exactly very enlightened and liberal. The fact that you got women, daughters coming up and saying, hey, there's no sons, so it's not right that our tribe doesn't have any inheritance then. Our part of the clan doesn't have any inheritance because sons were wiped out of our family, and Moses ends up agreeing with them. God tells Moses, yes, give them the thing. That is who just walked. Winnie. Angel. Deja. Oh boy. Anyway, big guy. Hey, big guy, there you are. All right. Heard me talking. Had to come over.
Yeah, that's what happens. You might know what's going on.
Yeah. Well, he's my cat. He always comes to me and follows me all over the house when I'm there and stuff and walking around. All 22 pounds of them. But anyway, so that's very liberal in the time, because that's unheard of. Other cultures of the time did not do that. Women did not have a place, and them even coming to the leader, Moses, and speaking would have been unheard of. So the fact that they're able to do that they have a hearing, that God endorses it, it kind of shows how God is just regardless to all people, regardless who they are, regardless of gender. We have Joshua's commission, that Joshua is going to succeed Moses. We shouldn't think of Joshua as being a young guy, because remember, Joshua had been Moses' age since the beginning when they came out of Egypt. He's been there a long time. So Joshua is close to 80 at this point. And then we talk about the tribal inheritance. And we divide up the different cities for the Levites also, and the cities of refuge, and have that. Now, in this, and the reason we include Psalm 90 is because Psalm 90 is our earliest psalm. It's the only psalm that's attributed to Moses. And it's a community prayer of petition, asking God to turn from his wrath. And if you think of all the different times that we just talked about, where Moses intervened with God, interceded with God on behalf of the people to turn God's wrath, we can understand where this psalm came from. And it has a fairly simple structure. It can be divided into three basic parts where you compare the divine eternity to our human mortality. But then interestingly, how God for us has decreed both. We are mortal and we have that mortality, but then we have the part of immortality with God. And then you have the part where it talks about asking a question, where is this justice if you're going to live your whole life under the wrath of God? So it's asking a question that a lot of people ask, well, if God's this punitive God that's always beating us down, where's the justice in that? And if we're never going to have God's blessing. And then it asks, may God's wrath turn away. Why? So that we can be near God and blessed to him. And if you think about it, that's the sense of us being created. We're creations. We're mortal, though. And in sin, we're living under God's wrath. But that's not the whole story. We can have the blessing of God. And live in that closer relationship with him. And so that's a fairly significant psalm in that way, too. So there you go. There's kind of an overview of Numbers and of Psalm 90. Anyone got any comments or questions or thoughts? Look at that. Hitting the hour mark right on the nose. Any questions, thoughts, comments? Shelley.
I think Joe should read all those names, and Joe should read all the names of all the people and the cities and all that fun stuff.
Okay.
And I think Shelley should sit back up there and make
I'll make him do it in the new member class on Sunday.
Good
all
to
right.
see you all.
Anybody else?
Yeah, what's the reading for next week?
Yes, the readings for next week. Hold on 1 second here. I think you can figure out what it's going to be, but it's a little
Yeah, we probably can.
bit broken down.
You must have a visitor setting someplace that you have to go.
Okay, so for next week, we'll be looking at Deuteronomy and Psalm 91.
Psalm what?
91.
91. So Deuteronomy and Psalm 91. Okay? And it'll be in the email too. If you look at that email I send out each week that I know everyone ignores nowadays because it's nothing new now. after a year of doing it. It's written in there too. All righty. Any other questions, thoughts, comments?
Good to be with you tonight.
Good to have you with us, Arlene. Yeah, it's good to see you. Can't wait till you're back.
Well, that'll be next week.
All right.
Night all.
Okay. Well,
Be
Thank
safe.
you.
Night all.
see you,
Good
everybody.
night.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Be safe on Friday.
There we go. Okay, turn that off.